This is a 2005 Ford GT, and it's one of my all-time favorite supercars. I say that with certainty and authority because I own one, but this one is different. It was parked outside for years, getting all gross and moldy until it was resurrected by Larry from Ammo NYC. And today I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this 2005 Ford GT is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This car has only 2,500 miles, and although it has been sitting for a while, it's been completely brought back to a beautiful state by Larry from Ammo NYC, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Ford GT, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, let's start with a general overview of the wonderful Ford GT. This is obviously a very special car, very different from what Ford usually builds, and they created this to celebrate Ford's 100th birthday, which was in 2003. Now, this is an 05 model, but Ford debuted the first GT40 concept car in 2002. They showed the first production cars in 03, and then it went into production in 04 as an 05 model. So it really was right around the time of Ford's 100th birthday. And one cool Easter egg in this car related to that, the headlight on the driver's side actually says 100. You can see this line on the side and the headlights 2 zeros to celebrate Ford's 100th birthday, a cool little Easter egg they threw in. So this car debuts to celebrate this special centennial of Ford. It comes out in 04 for the 05 and 06 model years. Everybody's all excited, and then sales were slow, actually. Ford planned to build 4,500 of these, but in the end, they only got a little over 4,000 out of the factory before some regulations changed, and rather than adapt the car to suit them, dealers said, please, no more, nobody is buying this car. There were deep discounts, and people weren't all that interested. And then the recession hit, and people became even less interested, and while the original sticker price is a little over $150,000, there are reports of Ford GTs trading hands during the recession for under $100,000 for one of these special iconic cars. Of course, nobody knew how iconic it would be at the time, that it was one of the last analog manual transmission, mid-engine, big engine supercars. And when the switch to automatic transmissions and hybrid powertrains and smaller engines started to happen, the market fell in love with the Ford GT. And now the very nicest examples are approaching $1 million for one of these, and even the crappiest bad title accident history cars seem to be over $300,000. I personally paid $225,000 for my Ford GT about 5 years ago, and it seemed like all the money in the world at the time. Of course, it turned out to be a pretty great decision, as these cars seem like they're only getting more and more desired by enthusiasts as the analog feel goes away. But anyway, next up, that overview out of the way, let's go through the quirks and features of the Ford GT. Because even though I own one of these, and I've made a few videos about my car, I've never done a full quirks and features tour of the Ford GT in my current video format. So let's do it now, and let's start with the name, Ford GT. Now, this car is a retro design based on the famous Ford GT40 race car of the 1960s, one of the most iconic Ford models of all time, and of course, now everybody knows about that car thanks to the Ford versus Ferrari movie. But it was always a special car in Ford's history, and this car was intended to be a modernized version of that, but they didn't use the name Ford GT, not GT40. That's because by the time Ford came out with this car, they had years earlier sold the rights to the GT40 name to a company that was building replica versions of the old GT40 race car. The cost to reacquire the name was deemed too high. So the original Ford GT concept car was called the GT40. Ford licensed the name for that, but they didn't buy it back for the actual production car. They decided to just call it the Ford GT. They didn't want to pay the money for the name, and also the name would have been inaccurate anyway. The original car was called the GT40 because it was 40 inches tall. This more modern version, in order to be more usable, is a little taller, about 44 inches as I recall. So GT40 didn't really make sense anyway. So on to getting into the Ford GT, where you instantly discover one of the laughable flaws of this car, and that would be the key fob, which is this. Yes, the same key fob on every other Ford model from its day, including the Taurus. In fact, the button they use for the trunk opener is an icon of a sedan with an arrow pointing to its trunk, rather than create even a special button for this amazing special supercar. The key itself is a little bit nicer. This key comes from the Lincoln LS luxury sedan, just with a Ford GT badge on it, but still a parts bin off the shelf from Lincoln instead of Ford, but not specially made for this car. And in terms of parts bin stuff, there's more than just that. Probably the greatest example of cheap cost cutting comes from the turn signal stock, which is right out of the Ford Focus. Same deal with the windshield wiper stock over on the other side. The steering wheel comes from the Ford Mustang of this era, and the parking brake feels flimsy and plasticky and cheap. I'm sure they borrowed that from some other Ford. Same deal with the switchgear and the doors. The window switches come from other Ford models, nothing special here, and the power mirror control is also shared among crappy $20,000 cheap Fords, and then the amazing Ford GT supercar. Now, I have talked to people at Ford about this. Why did you do that? Why did you give this car so many cheap Ford parts? And they said they really had no idea what to expect from the Ford GT, if people would like it or buy it, and they really wanted to keep the price point around $150,000. You got to remember, no American brand had ever done anything like this. The Dodge Viper was around, but at half the price, and the Corvette was even cheaper. An American company debuting a mid-engine six-figure Ferrari fighting supercar, it just wasn't done, and Ford didn't want it to get too expensive, hence the parts sharing with other Ford models. Of course, initially it seemed like they had made the right decision. These weren't very popular and they started to depreciate, but now that this is considered an icon, a legendary car, Ford people have told me they wish they had done things a little differently, but that's only with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, it made sense to cheap out on this interior stuff, so they did. Now, one thing that absolutely wasn't shared with other Ford models is the design of the doors, which is completely insane. You open the door and you'll notice not just the door opens, but also a good chunk of the car's roof opens along with the door. The door has a roof attached to it, and not a small roof, but like 18 inches of roof. And it's like this on both sides, driver and passenger. Now, the original Ford GT40 race car was like this because the roof had a little bubble in it to accommodate a racing helmet for a driver and potentially a passenger. And so it had a functional purpose at the time. In this car, the road-going modern version, it does not have a functional purpose. And in fact, it makes the car tremendously difficult to get into if you park near something, because you can't just open the door a little way since the roof blocks your access to the interior. It is one of the all-time worst door designs ever. In fact, I met the designer of this car, Camillo Pardo, a few years ago, and he told me he fought the engineers hard to make sure the GT kept that heritage door design. And I was thinking to myself, why did you do that? I can't park next to anything in my Ford GT, but that's part of the charm of this car. One other issue you'll notice with the doors, because of their roof situation, it could hit you in the head. You can see if you sit down but don't get all the way in and then go to close the door, it can hit your side of your head, your forehead, can even take off a few strands of hair if you're not careful. And so Ford GT owners tend to get used to working themselves around the doors and finding parking spots that fit with this bizarre door design. But anyway, next we climb inside the Ford GT, and I have to say, although I make fun of some of the switchgear for being cheap and shared with other Ford models, there's also a lot of very cool and very special stuff in this car. Probably the best example, these toggle switches here in the center control stack to turn on the hazard lights, the headlights. They look very 1960s, very old school cool, and that's an amazingly neat feature that they integrated into this car's design. And there's a lot more. The manual transmission lever with the silver ball on top, that looks cool. Of course, all of these cars had a manual transmission. There was no automatic version, and this is how they all looked, and it is very nice and very satisfying. And I also happen to think it's one of the great manual transmissions to drive of any car ever, but I'll cover that more when I get behind the wheel and drive it. More cool stuff in this interior. One very interesting item is the climate controls, which are located here in the center console, like where the armrest should be. Those are your climate controls. 3 silver dials and a couple of buttons, and the interesting part is they're not backlit, so you don't have lights from behind telling you what everything does. Instead, the dials, they pop up from the center console, and there's lighting inside of them, which was intended to illuminate the diagrams that surround them, showing how to operate the climate controls. A tremendously interesting way to do this. It functions okay, but more importantly, it's just kind of a fun design exercise, and I've always loved it. I've also always loved the gauges in this car, which are rather interesting. You got your tachometer directly in front of the steering wheel, and then the rest of the gauges sort of go out from there towards the passenger side of the dashboard, ending with the speedometer. That's the furthest one away, but it's also tilted towards the driver to make it easy to see. A very cool gauge pod, again, very different from anything that Ford was making at this time. Now, with that said, one drawback of the gauges being so long and wide on this dashboard, they take the place of the climate vent. So this car only has 3, 2 on the passenger side and only 1 for the driver on the driver's side. But owning one of these cars, I've never felt the climate vents, climate control situation was bad. It's a small interior, so you don't really need all that much air in order to heat it up or cool it down. Now, one other interesting quirk in this interior is the seats, leathered sport seats that hug you, grip you in place. But the interesting thing about them is the holes in the center. A lot of people see these holes in my Ford GT and they ask a lot of questions. For one, is it climate control? Is this where the vents are? Because if you look into the holes, you can see little dots, maybe makes it look like that. People also think it's a stereo speaker. It's neither of those things. It's just there for style, and frankly, it's not as uncomfortable as you might think. Sitting on that stuff, your body sort of spreads out its weight, and those little holes don't really dig into your back. You don't really feel them while you're driving, and frankly, I've never had a problem sitting in the car on these seats, but they certainly are distinctive. Now, one very interesting difference in this Ford GT compared to my Ford GT is there's a giant speaker in between the seats. There were 4 options available on the 0506 Ford GT, and this was one of them. It was the Macintosh sound system. That was one of the options, and it included a big speaker between the seats and this Macintosh head unit in the middle, as you can see, which remains factory original on this car. Now, the benefit of the Macintosh sound system was obvious. The sound was improved over the base model non-optional stereo, whatever it was. In my car, it was replaced years ago by improved units with Bluetooth audio and even a backup camera at one point. But the Macintosh cars had better sound. But the drawback was that this this giant speaker between the seats kind of covered up your view into the engine. And specifically, you couldn't really see the supercharger pulley through your rear view mirror, which is a nice touch of cars without the Macintosh system. The other drawback of the Macintosh sound system is you lost a little storage cubby that was between the two seat backs. This was actually a rather important little storage cubby because without it, there is no storage anywhere in this car's interior. There is no glove box in the Ford GT, and there's no storage on the door panels either, as you can see. And so in my car with no Macintosh, you got a little storage between the seats, but that's pretty much it. Otherwise, you were stuck with your only storage compartment being this tiny little spot in the passenger footwell that was maybe big enough for the owner's manuals, and that was about it. This car wasn't really focused on practicality. Now, you're probably thinking, well, the Macintosh sound system was one of the 4 options, so what were the other 3 options available in these Ford GTs? Interestingly, they were all on the outside. The interiors of these cars were identical, except for the sound system, or not the sound system, but outside you had a few choices. One of the other options was racing stripes, which this car has. You can see these blue painted racing stripes going down the center. That was an optional extra. Another option was red painted brake calipers, which this car does not have, as you can see. And the final option was BBS wheels. There was an optional extra cost wheel. The vast majority of these Ford GTs have it, but this one does not. These are the base model wheels, the regular standard ones. So this is only a 2-option car. With the Macintosh sound system and the racing stripes, it's missing the other 2. My Ford GT is a 3-option car, missing only the sound system. Now, as you can imagine, the market values 4-option cars the highest, and then 3-option, and then 2-option, etc. And I generally understand why that's true, although I must admit, these are the wheels. I have always felt this wheel design just looks better than the BBS wheels that were optional and are more desirable. These entry-level base model Ford GT wheels to me just suit the look of the car so much better, and I love these wheels and I wish I had them on my Ford GT, but I don't. But this one does, and I love it. Also worth pointing out, these base model wheels are far rarer than the optional BBSs. Like I mentioned, the vast majority of GTs have those, and so these are actually the more special, less commonly seen, and in my opinion, better looking wheel on this car. And next up, since I'm on the outside of this Ford GT, let's talk about the exterior quirks of this car, starting with these little silver latches in front of the doors. Look kind of interesting. They're there with the intent to mimic the look of these clamps on the original GT40 race car. You can see these are here to clamp down the front compartment so it doesn't come up while you're racing. In the modern car, these silver panels don't have that same purpose, but they do have a purpose. They're not just there for style. On the passenger side, you can see the panel is next to a keyhole. You put the key in, twist it, pull on the latch, and the fuel door opens up on the front fender. So this latch opens the fuel door, and indeed, that's basically the only way to open the fuel door on this car. Over on the driver's side, you can see that silver panel is again mounted next to a keyhole. Put the key in, pull on the panel, and then you can lift up the front luggage compartment, and that's how you get inside the front trunk. Now, this panel can also be opened from the key fob. You press the sedan trunk opener button, and you can open up this front compartment, or you can do it the hard way, the cool way, on the outside using the exterior latch. Not too many cars have their trunk latch displayed as like a style component on the outside. And since we're talking luggage compartment, as you can see, it's not really much of one. You can't get anything in here. Since I already mentioned there's not much interior storage, you can see this particular car not especially practical if you want to take bags or frankly anything with you. That really wasn't the purpose of the Ford GT. And next up, since we're opening stuff in this car, let's talk about the rear clamshell and the rear engine compartment in the Ford GT. Starting with opening it up, which is actually kind of a pain. Unlatching it is easy enough. There's a little latch on the ceiling in the back near like the headrest and seat backs. You pull on that and it unlatches the rear compartment, but then there are two individual latches that keep it in place that you have to unlatch at the same time. So you do one and then reach all the way across the car to do the other, which almost turns opening the engine compartment into a two-person job. It's not really ideal. In my Ford GT, I have an aftermarket part that connects the two, so you can just press on a bar and it opens them both, and I highly recommend GT owners who plan on using their cars install that bar. It is very helpful. But once you have this rear compartment open, you can see the engine. Massive supercharged V8 in the Ford GT. In stock form, this made 550 horsepower and about 500 pound-feet of torque, which is a lot, and especially was a lot back then. Competing against the Ferrari F430, the Lamborghini Gallardo, this car had more power. And you can see the supercharger pulley up front. It just plain looks cool in this car. Now, people who talk about this engine often say, well, the Ford GT has a truck motor. Sometimes that's meant as a compliment to illustrate how reliable this car is, and sometimes it's meant as a complaint, comparing this to the finely tuned European precision sports cars. But regardless, it's not entirely true. Yes, this is a variation of the 5.4-liter modular V8 that Ford put in a lot of cars. And this particular one has its roots in the top-of-the-line version that was in the Lincoln Navigator, the Lincoln Blackwood, a fine automobile, and the Shelby Mustangs from this era, the GT500, etc. But this engine has been highly modified and upgraded compared to those, and there's not as much part sharing as you might think. I know this because I take my Ford GT to the dealer and they say, yeah, we don't make that anymore. I mean, what about the Navigator? Yeah, we don't share that with the Navigator. So it has its roots in a regular truck engine, but that's about where it ends, the roots. Now, a couple other cool things in here. The Powered by Ford logos on the side just look so cool. And over on the driver's side, you also have a plaque, Ford GT, with some signatures, I guess, of the people on the production line who finished assembling this engine. It's just so cool to look at this and see how special it is, particularly since cars have gone away from these big V8s in the years since this came out. Now, one other item worth noting back here, every time I open the rear compartment on my Ford GT, the first thing people comment on is not the engine, but the tires, which are huge, and they're fully revealed with the clamshell open. They're massive 345 width rear tires, still big by modern standards, huge 20 years ago when this car was being developed, but that's what you're running in the Ford GT. One other interesting thing with this clamshell, you open it, you can see it doesn't fully open. The entire rear of the car doesn't open, some of it stays in place, and that is to conform with regulations that say the tail lights and brake lights have to stay put. So you open the engine compartment in this car, the tail lights need to stay where they are, and they do, and that's how Ford was able to make it work. Also worth noting, on the rear part that stays fixed in place, you have this little black flap running across the entire rear of the car. That turns out to be important. Ford people have told me that this car without that flap develops some lift or has some difficult handling characteristics at higher speeds. Just that tiny little flap stopped those undesirable traits, but that's there for a reason. Not a huge wing, but an effective one nonetheless. Another interesting thing in back, there's no branding back there at all. You don't have a Ford logo, doesn't say GT, nothing like that in back. And despite this car's iconic, legendary status, and despite how popular the Ford versus Ferrari movie is, when I'm driving my Ford GT, a good number of people still come up to me and say, what is that car? Because from a good portion of the angles, especially around the rear, there's no badging at all to tell people what it is. Now, two other interesting items on the outside worth pointing out. One, there is a glass panel that lets you see the engine from the outside, which only adds to the cool factor. This was starting to show up on exotic cars in the late 90s, and Ford took full advantage, and I love that. You also have these rear view mirrors that have an interesting design. They're sort of rounded on the front to give them an aerodynamic shape. I assume that's a retro touch, but regardless, it just plain looks cool, and it's a way to make mirrors, which are usually hated by car designers for sticking up off the side of the beauty. It's a way to make them look kind of cool with this car. All right, we're driving the Ford GT. This is Larry from Ammo NYC, who made it beautiful, and now it's raining. So I drive my Ford GT every single day, but I haven't driven another one in like a decade. So this is so interesting for me. I love everything about this car. I have one. I'm surprised you said it was a dream car of yours. I always love to hear that.
It was.
How come you never got one?
A little pricey for me. A little pricey.
They were cheaper for a while.
They were cheaper then, yeah.
I know, I paid $225 for mine, and at the time I thought I was paying the moon, and I was making a huge mistake.
Wow.
And now, you know, $350 is kind of like a floor. I love this car.
Yeah, it sounds much better when you're driving. I guess when you get it out over $2,000, you know, it really starts to come.
The thing about this car that I love the most is that it's so usable. I've never had any problems with mine. I've done 10,000 miles on my car. I'm at 41,000 miles, and I've never had any issues. And I just drive it everywhere. I take it to the store. I take it to everywhere you could possibly drive a car. I drive mine, and I just love it. And that's the cool thing. I also like you mentioned, we're two big guys, like tall guys in this car, but like you fit, like it's okay. It's not like some super.
Yeah,
I mean,
they have like cutouts here.
They have cutouts in the doors, yeah. It's not like some exotic cars where you're like this, and it's a total compromise. I've always thought that was a nice thing about this car. I always tell people it was made for Americans. And indeed, you can be big, you can be tall, you can be whatever. I love the way the gear shift feels in this car. I always have. Being able to just rev match downshift, I think it feels so natural. And I also think it feels amazing once it gets warm. That's when I think this car really, the feel of the shifter and the clutch is just truly, I think, one of the very best of any exotic car that I've ever driven.
I also think it's in the perfect position.
Yeah.
It's like your hand
right where you want it to be.
Rests on.
That's right. But this car, actually, my car looks pretty nice. This car is, you know, the interiors are all basically the same, but this car is just like a newer, nicer, less scuffed example of what my car could be. I love this car. I always have. It is one of my all-time favorite exotic cars, and I'm so thrilled that I own one, and I really don't think I'll ever sell it. I just bought a Quirks GT. That is the coolest car in the world, but this is so much more drivable, and that's what I love about it. It's like the exotic. I consider this to be like the most iconic car that you can use frequently.
Right. I'm a big fan of that. When you have to like do 50 things to get into a car to take it for that 1 month, a month drive, it's like,
what's the point?
Why have that?
Yeah. This one's great. You did an amazing job cleaning it up. I can't believe how nice it is now.
There was a lot going on. Yeah. I find the seats the easiest I've ever had to remove in any car, because I remove seats all the time. Usually they're rusted, and usually 10,000 bolts that come with it. This one's like 4 bolts. In and out.
This car is pretty simple. That's one of its benefits. Like I always tell people I like to buy exotic cars from companies that make regular cars, like Ford and Porsche, because like they don't do dumb stuff for the sake of doing dumb stuff like Ferrari does. Oh man, Ford GT, still one of the best.
So I can tell you that.
Yeah, everybody freaks out driving this car around, and I think white helps. This is my very favorite spec. This color with these stripes, with these wheels, this combo is the one I always wanted.
Well, it's coming up for sale, by the way. You can
on Cars and Babes. Yeah, it's interesting. Even though this car sat for a long time, one thing I will say, it drives a lot like mine that I use every day. I think these cars are, like I've been saying, are usable, they're reliable, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to do a bunch of stuff. It's been sitting, you're worried about all these things. I mean, it's a Ford. Like, I think it's a fairly serviceable, usable.
I was watching them change the oil. I mean, it's harder to do any other car that I have.
Yeah, despite sitting for so long, this car drives like a Ford GT. Like, it doesn't seem to have any obvious issues that I can tell, and it seems nice, tightly screwed together. There's not like weird, clanging or sounds, or it feels great. It feels tight. I would drive this car.
It should be driven.
It should be driven.
It needs to be driven on lunch right now. Knock some dust off.
Feels so good. God, I love this car. I love this car so much. I always
It's very
have.
linear power too.
It is very, the great benefit of that's one of the reasons why this car has taken off so much. The end of the supercharged big V8 era as opposed to now turbo cars. Power's not quite as linear. It's a different situation. And so that's the 2005 Ford GT, one of my all-time favorite exotic sports cars, a car that I own and love myself. And this one looks fantastic thanks to Larry from Ammo NYC. And you can buy it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Ford GT a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 65 out of 100, which places the Ford GT here against other cars from this era. I know I own one, and so people might call me biased, but the Ford GT is quite simply the coolest of all these cars. It's amazing to drive, it's reliable, it's been a fantastic investment for basically everyone who has bought it. It's much rarer than stuff like the Ferrari F430, Mercedes SLS, and Porsche 997 Turbo, and it's just plain iconic. I love the Ford GT. I give it a high score, but not because I own it. It's the exact opposite. I own it because I think it's so great.